So this is what happens when you sell your house, Jessica said with a thin smile. You become homeless. The words hung in the air long after the laughter around the dinner table faded. Margaret Whitmore didn't respond right away. She simply folded her napkin slowly and placed it beside her plate, the same careful way she had done at family dinners for more than 40 years. Margaret was 68 years old, and until 3 months earlier, she had lived in the same white two-story house on Maplewood Drive for nearly 35 years. It was the house where her son Daniel had taken his first steps across the living room carpet. The house where Christmas lights wrapped around the porch every December. The house her late husband had painted himself one long summer weekend back in 1994. But that house was gone now. Margaret had signed the closing papers on a bright Tuesday morning in early spring, sliding the pen across the final document while the realtor congratulated her politely. She told everyone the same thing afterward. It was just a practical decision. Houses were expensive to maintain. A smaller place would be easier. That was the explanation she gave her neighbors, the bank clerk, even the kind woman at the coffee shop who asked where she had been lately. What Margaret never said out loud was that she hadn't sold the house for convenience. She sold it because Daniel had called her one evening sounding tired and worried in a way she hadn't heard since he was a teenager. His business was struggling, he said. Bills were stacking up. Investors were losing patience. He didn't ask directly for money, but Margaret understood what he meant before the conversation even ended. Daniel had always been proud. Asking for help wasn't easy for him. So Margaret made the decision quietly the way she had made most important decisions in her life. She would help her son. A week later she began preparing the house for sale, boxing photographs, wrapping dishes, and walking slowly through each room as if committing it all to memory. When the sale finally closed, the number written on the final document was large enough to stabilize Daniel's business overnight. Margaret didn't hesitate for a second. She transferred the funds to him the very next morning. Daniel sounded relieved. Grateful, even. He promised everything would turn around soon. He promised he would take care of her once things improved. Margaret believed him. She had always believed her son. After the sale, Margaret moved into a modest one-bedroom apartment about 4 miles away. 700 square feet, one small balcony, and a parking space just outside the building. It wasn't the life she once imagined, but she told herself it was temporary. Families helped each other through difficult seasons. That was how the world was supposed to work. For the first few weeks, things seemed normal enough. Daniel called occasionally. Jessica was polite, though distant. Margaret assumed they were simply busy rebuilding the business. Then came the dinner invitation. Daniel said they wanted to celebrate the company's sudden recovery. Margaret arrived with a small apple pie she had baked that afternoon, the same recipe Daniel loved when he was a boy. The evening began pleasantly enough. Plates were filled. Glasses clinked. Conversation drifted from business updates to vacation plans. Then Jessica leaned back in her chair, glanced across the table, and said the sentence that would echo in Margaret's mind for weeks afterward. So this is what happens when you sell your house, she said lightly. You become homeless. For a moment, no one spoke. Margaret looked down at her plate, noticing the pattern on the china she had once given Daniel and Jessica as a wedding gift. Across the table, Daniel avoided her eyes. And in that quiet, Margaret realized something she had not expected to learn at 68 years old. Sometimes the greatest sacrifice a mother could make was also the moment she quietly disappeared from the life she thought she had built. Margaret Whitmore left the dinner that evening with the apple pie still sitting untouched on the kitchen counter. She did not mention it. She simply thanked Daniel for inviting her, picked up her purse, and walked to her car as calmly as she always did. The drive back to her apartment took about 12 minutes, following the same quiet road past the grocery store and the small public library that closed at 8 o'clock every night. Margaret kept both hands on the steering wheel and watched the streetlights pass one by one across the windshield. She had learned long ago that reacting too quickly rarely solved anything. By the time she reached the parking lot of her apartment building, the word Jessica had used earlier that evening was still echoing quietly in her mind. Homeless. It was an odd word to choose, Margaret thought. Technically, she had a roof over her head, a lease agreement, and a small kitchen where the coffee maker still worked perfectly every morning at 7. Yet the word carried a different meaning now, one that had nothing to do with real estate or square footage. The apartment itself was simple but clean. 700 square feet of carefully arranged furniture, a small dining table by the window, and two framed photographs resting on the shelf near the hallway. One photograph showed Daniel as a boy wearing a Little League uniform several sizes too large for him. The other showed Margaret and her husband Thomas standing on the porch of the Maplewood house many years earlier, smiling in the bright summer sun. Margaret placed her purse on the kitchen counter and turned on the small lamp near the sofa. The room filled with a soft yellow glow that made the space feel warmer than it really was. She removed her coat slowly and hung it on the same hook she always used. Routine had always comforted her. Simple actions, predictable patterns. She made herself a cup of tea, measured the water carefully, and waited while the kettle warmed on the stove. Outside, a passing car rolled through the quiet street and disappeared again. Margaret sat at the table with the cup between her hands and allowed the silence to settle. The dinner replayed in her memory piece by piece. Jessica leaning back in her chair. The casual tone of her voice. Daniel staring at the table instead of speaking. Margaret had raised Daniel to be kind. She knew that much was true. When he was 8 years old, he once rode his bicycle 3 blocks just to return a wallet he found near the park. When he was 15, he spent an entire weekend helping an elderly neighbor repair a broken fence. That boy had existed. Margaret was certain of it, which meant something else had changed along the way. She did not accuse anyone in her thoughts. She simply observed the difference the way she might study a photograph taken years apart. Small details began returning to her mind. The way financial conversations suddenly ended whenever she entered the room during recent visits. The way Jessica had started answering questions meant for Daniel. The way Daniel himself had begun using phrases that sounded unfamiliar, almost rehearsed, whenever business matters were mentioned. Margaret took a slow sip of her tea and looked around the apartment again. The place was quiet, organized, and far smaller than the home she had once known. Yet something inside her felt unexpectedly clear. She had spent most of her life trusting the people she loved without question. Tonight had introduced a small pause in that habit. Not anger, not resentment, just a pause long enough for her to begin looking more carefully at the story unfolding around her. The next morning, Margaret Whitmore woke up at exactly 6:30, the same time she had woken up for most of her adult life. The small bedroom in her apartment was quiet except for the distant sound of a delivery truck turning onto the street below. She sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, letting her feet rest on the cool wooden floor while the events of the previous evening settled again in her memory. The sentence Jessica had spoken still lingered in her mind, not loud anymore, but steady, like a line written across a page that could not easily be erased. Margaret stood, walked to the kitchen, and prepared breakfast the same way she always did. 2 pieces of toast, a small bowl of oatmeal, and a cup of black coffee measured carefully with the same spoon she had owned for years. Routine helped her think. It slowed the world down enough for details to appear clearly. Sunlight began slipping through the blinds above the kitchen sink as she sat at the table. From her window, she could see the narrow parking lot and a row of small maple trees planted along the sidewalk. The apartment building itself was modest but well kept. 3 floors, beige siding, and a small laundry room at the end of the hallway that smelled faintly of detergent. Margaret had chosen the place because it was close to everything she needed. The grocery store was less than half a mile away. The pharmacy sat just across the intersection. At the time, the apartment had seemed like a sensible temporary step while Daniel recovered financially. Margaret finished her coffee and rinsed the cup slowly in the sink. As she dried it with a towel, another memory surfaced, one she had not thought about in months. It was from late autumn, about 6 weeks before she decided to sell the house. Daniel and Jessica had visited for dinner that evening. Jessica spent most of the night talking about business expansion and new opportunities. She had described markets, partnerships, and the importance of moving quickly before competitors gained an advantage. Margaret remembered noticing how confidently Jessica spoke about Daniel's company, sometimes even answering questions before Daniel had a chance to respond himself. At the time, Margaret assumed it was simply enthusiasm. Jessica had always been ambitious. But now, standing in the quiet kitchen of her apartment, the memory felt slightly different. Another moment followed it. A phone call Daniel had made just a few days before the house went on the market. He sounded stressed, but there had been something else in his voice as well. Hesitation, as if he was choosing his words very carefully. Margaret walked into the living room and sat down in the armchair near the window. The photograph of Daniel in his Little League uniform rested on the shelf across from her. The boy in that picture looked hopeful, proud, and certain that the people around him would always guide him in the right direction. Margaret studied the photo quietly. She still believed her son had a good heart. That belief had not disappeared. But she also understood something new now. People did not always change all at once. Sometimes the change happened slowly, influenced by voices that spoke often enough and confidently enough to reshape decisions over time. Margaret leaned back in the chair and folded her hands in her lap. She was not angry. Anger would only cloud the small details she was beginning to notice. Instead, she allowed herself to examine the situation the way her late husband Thomas used to examine complicated repair projects in their garage, piece by piece, one part at a time. The business crisis Daniel described, the speed with which the money had been transferred, Jessica's unusual confidence during financial conversations, and finally the careless word she had spoken at dinner as if it carried no weight at all. Margaret realized that for the first time since selling the house, she was no longer looking at the situation through the lens of trust alone. She was beginning to look at it with patience, curiosity, and something even more powerful, attention. Later that afternoon, Margaret Whitmore decided to take a walk, something she had begun doing almost every day since moving into the apartment. The weather was mild for early spring, and the sidewalks around the neighborhood were lined with young maple trees that had just started showing the first small green leaves of the season. Margaret walked slowly, her hands folded lightly around the strap of her purse as she followed the same path toward the grocery store and then back again. Walking helped her think, and thinking had become more important over the past 24 hours than it had been in months. She noticed details more carefully now, the way people spoke, the timing of certain conversations, the spaces between words that once felt ordinary but now seemed worth remembering. When she returned to her apartment building, she checked the mailbox near the entrance. Most of the envelopes inside were advertisements or routine bills, but one thin envelope caught her attention immediately. It was from the bank that had handled the closing for the sale of her house. Margaret carried the mail upstairs and sat at the small dining table by the window before opening it. Inside was a routine confirmation letter related to the final transfer of funds that had taken place several weeks earlier. Margaret had already completed that transfer herself, sending nearly the entire amount to Daniel the morning after the closing. She remembered the exact moment. She had sat at this same table with her laptop open, carefully entering the numbers while double-checking every digit before pressing the final confirmation button. At the time, she felt relieved. Helping her son had felt natural, almost automatic. Now she studied the document again with slower eyes. The letter itself contained nothing surprising, yet it reminded her of something she had not considered before. Large financial decisions always left a paper trail. Transfers, confirmations, account notes, timelines. Margaret stood up, walked to the small bookshelf near the hallway, and retrieved the folder where she had stored the paperwork related to the house sale. She had always been organized. Her late husband Thomas used to joke that Margaret could probably find a tax receipt from 20 years earlier in less than 30 seconds. Sitting back down at the table, she opened the folder and began reviewing the documents one by one. Closing statements, transfer confirmations, real estate forms. Everything appeared orderly, exactly as it should. Yet as she continued reading, another thought surfaced quietly in her mind. Daniel had said his business was on the edge of collapse. Investors losing patience. Urgent deadlines. But Margaret realized she had never actually seen any of the financial reports he mentioned. She had trusted his explanation completely. That trust had never felt like a risk before. Margaret leaned back in her chair and looked again toward the photograph of Daniel as a child across the room. She did not assume her son had lied. That was not where her thoughts were going. Instead, she considered another possibility, one that seemed increasingly realistic with every passing minute. Daniel might not have been the one making all the decisions anymore. Jessica had always spoken confidently about the company. She used phrases about expansion and opportunity as if she had been part of the business strategy for years. Margaret remembered how quickly the house had been placed on the market after that autumn dinner conversation. She also remembered how calm Jessica seemed when the sale finally closed, as if the outcome had been expected all along. Margaret closed the folder slowly and rested her hands on the table. Her expression remained calm, the same quiet composure she had shown at dinner the night before. But inside her mind something had shifted. Not anger, not accusation, just a simple decision to stop assuming and start verifying. And for the first time since leaving Maplewood Drive, Margaret Whitmore realized that the story she had believed about the past few months might not be the complete one. The following morning, Margaret Whitmore woke with the same quiet determination that had begun forming the day before. She prepared breakfast slowly, measuring coffee into the machine and placing 2 slices of bread into the toaster, while the small kitchen filled with the familiar smell of morning routine. Outside the window, the parking lot was already beginning to fill as neighbors left for work. Margaret sat at the table with a notepad beside her cup and began writing down a few simple dates. The day Daniel called her sounding worried. The week the house was listed for sale. The exact morning the funds had been transferred to his business account. She did not rush. Each date went onto the page carefully, as if she were assembling the outline of a story that had happened too quickly the first time. After finishing breakfast, Margaret opened the folder again and reviewed the transfer confirmation from the bank. The amount was large enough to stabilize almost any small company, at least temporarily. Daniel had sounded relieved when he received it. That part of the memory felt genuine. Yet Margaret remembered something else from that phone call as well. Daniel had not described specific numbers. He had not explained exactly which investors were leaving or what debts were pressing the company so urgently. He had simply said the situation was serious. At the time, Margaret had not asked for details because asking would have felt like questioning her own son. Now she realized how unusual that silence had been. Margaret closed the folder and looked at the clock above the stove. It was just after 9 in the morning. Most businesses were already open. A quiet idea formed in her mind, simple and practical. If Daniel's company had truly been facing the kind of crisis he described, there would be records of it. Business filings, loan documents, partnership announcements. Information about companies was often easier to find than people expected. Margaret turned on her laptop and placed it gently on the kitchen table. The screen brightened the room as she began typing Daniel's company name into the search bar. Several articles appeared from local business websites and regional trade publications. Margaret adjusted her glasses and began reading slowly. The first article described the company expanding into 2 new markets during the previous quarter. The second article mentioned a partnership opportunity that had attracted attention from investors. Neither article used language that suggested a company on the edge of collapse. Margaret leaned back in her chair and read the dates again. Both articles were published only weeks before Daniel called her that evening asking for help. She continued searching. Another report mentioned a new office lease signed downtown. Another described a conference appearance where Daniel and Jessica both spoke about future growth. Margaret noticed something interesting as she read. Jessica's name appeared often, sometimes even before Daniel's. Margaret rested her hands quietly on the table. The pieces were beginning to arrange themselves differently now, not in a dramatic way, but in the slow, careful way that truth sometimes revealed itself when enough attention was given to the small details. Daniel may have believed the expansion plan was necessary. Jessica may have encouraged him to move quickly before competitors acted first. And somewhere inside that urgency, the idea of asking Margaret for help had formed. Margaret did not assume the plan had been cruel from the beginning, but she could no longer pretend that everything had happened by accident. The decision to sell the house had been immediate. The transfer of money had been immediate. Yet the business plans themselves appeared to have existed long before Daniel ever picked up the phone that evening. Margaret closed the laptop slowly and looked around the small apartment again. The quiet space no longer felt temporary in the way she once imagined. Instead, it felt like the beginning of a different kind of chapter, one where she would move forward with the same patience she had used all her life, but with a new understanding guiding every step she took. The afternoon sunlight moved slowly across the floor of Margaret Whitmore's apartment as she sat quietly in the armchair near the window. The laptop on the small table beside her had gone dark, but the information she had read earlier remained clear in her mind. Companies that were collapsing did not usually announce expansion into 2 new markets. Businesses on the edge of failure rarely signed new office leases downtown. Yet the articles she had found described growth, opportunity, and ambitious plans for the future. None of it matched the urgency Daniel had described during that phone call months earlier. Margaret did not rush to judgment. She had spent most of her life understanding that situations were rarely as simple as they first appeared. Still, The pattern forming in her mind felt difficult to ignore. She stood up and walked to the bookshelf where several old address books rested beside a small wooden box that once belonged to her husband Thomas. Inside the address book were phone numbers written over decades, some faded, some crossed out, others carefully updated in Margaret's steady handwriting. She flipped through the pages slowly until she found the name she was looking for. Robert Ellis. The name brought back a quiet memory. Robert had been the family attorney for nearly 20 years, first working with Thomas when they purchased the Maplewood house and later helping them organize legal documents after Thomas passed away. Margaret had not spoken to him in several months, but she knew his office was still located 3 blocks from the courthouse downtown. Margaret hesitated for only a moment before picking up her phone and dialing the number written beside his name. The call connected after 3 rings. Robert's voice sounded older than she remembered, but still calm and professional. Margaret explained that she had recently sold her home and wanted to review a few documents related to her finances, nothing urgent, just a careful check to ensure everything was properly organized. Robert agreed immediately and suggested she stop by the office later that week. After ending the call, Margaret returned to the window and looked down at the quiet street below. Cars passed occasionally, their engines fading into the distance as they moved through the neighborhood. The world outside continued its normal rhythm, unaware of the quiet shift taking place in Margaret's understanding of recent events. She was not planning confrontation. That was not her way. Instead, she was following the same careful principle that had guided her through most of life's challenges. When uncertainty appeared, gather the facts. When emotions ran high, slow the process down. Margaret had already learned one important thing during the past 2 days. The story she believed about Daniel's financial emergency might not be complete. Whether that missing piece came from misunderstanding, pressure, or something else entirely was still unclear. But Robert Ellis had helped their family through complicated matters before, and Margaret trusted his ability to examine documents with patience and clarity. She glanced once more at the photograph of Daniel in his Little League uniform resting on the shelf across the room. The boy in the picture looked determined, holding a baseball glove that seemed almost too large for his small hands. Margaret felt a familiar mixture of affection and quiet concern as she studied the image. Whatever had happened in recent months, she still believed her son had not intended to cause harm. But intentions and outcomes were rarely the same thing. As the afternoon light faded and the apartment grew slightly dimmer, Margaret Whitmore realized that the next step forward would not involve arguments or accusations. It would involve information, documents, and patience. And sometimes patience revealed truths that rushed conversations never could. 2 days later, Margaret Whitmore drove downtown to meet Robert Ellis. The morning was cool and clear, and the courthouse square looked almost exactly the same as it had 10 years earlier when she and Thomas had last visited the attorney's office together. Margaret parked her car along the curb and walked slowly toward the brick building on the corner where Robert had worked for most of his career. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood, the same quiet atmosphere Margaret remembered from years before. Robert greeted her with a warm but professional smile and guided her into a small office lined with bookshelves filled with legal binders. Margaret placed the folder containing the house sale documents on the desk and explained that she simply wanted a second set of eyes to review everything. Robert adjusted his glasses and began reading through the papers carefully, page by page, occasionally making a small note with his pen but otherwise remaining silent. Margaret sat across from him and waited patiently, her hands folded in her lap as she watched the slow rhythm of his review. Nearly 20 minutes passed before Robert leaned back slightly in his chair. He did not look alarmed, but his expression carried the thoughtful seriousness of someone who had just noticed something worth discussing. He asked Margaret a few gentle questions about the timeline of events. When exactly Daniel had called, how quickly the house had been listed, whether she had seen any formal financial documents from the company before transferring the funds. Margaret answered honestly. No, she had not seen financial reports. No, the house had been listed only a few days after that phone call. Yes, the full amount had been transferred immediately after the closing. Robert nodded slowly, as if assembling the same timeline Margaret had begun considering earlier in the week. He then opened another drawer in his desk and removed a thin folder containing public business filings. Companies, especially those expanding quickly, often filed certain updates with state offices, and those filings were available to attorneys who knew where to look. Robert scanned the documents briefly before turning one page around so Margaret could see the date printed near the top. The filing described a planned expansion for Daniel's company and was dated almost 2 months before Daniel had called Margaret asking for help. Margaret read the page quietly without reacting. She simply absorbed the information the way she had absorbed every other detail during the past few days. The timeline was becoming clearer. The expansion plan had existed long before the emergency phone call. The business had not been collapsing at that time. Instead, it had been preparing to grow. Robert did not accuse anyone of dishonesty. That was not his role. He simply explained that business expansions often required large amounts of capital and that entrepreneurs sometimes sought funding from multiple sources when traditional investors hesitated. Margaret listened carefully and thanked him for the clarification. When the meeting ended, she placed the documents back into her folder and walked out of the office with the same steady pace she had carried into the building earlier. Outside, the courthouse clock struck noon as people crossed the square heading toward nearby restaurants for lunch. Margaret paused for a moment beside her car and looked at the busy street. The pieces of the story now formed a pattern she could no longer ignore. The expansion plan, the urgent phone call, the immediate house sale, the casual remark Jessica had made at dinner as if the outcome had been obvious all along. Margaret did not feel anger rising inside her. Instead, she felt something quieter and far more powerful. Clarity. For the first time since leaving Maplewood Drive, she understood that the decision she had made months earlier had not simply been a mother helping her son during a sudden crisis. It had been something more calculated than that. And now that Margaret Whitmore understood the truth, the next steps would be taken with the same patience and precision that had guided her through every important decision in her life. That evening, Margaret Whitmore returned to her apartment with the folder resting quietly on the passenger seat beside her. The traffic through town was light, and the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the road as she drove the familiar route back to the small building where she now lived. When she reached the parking lot, she remained seated in the car for a moment before turning off the engine. The information Robert had shown her earlier in the day did not feel dramatic or explosive. It felt precise. Dates on official documents. Timelines that did not match the story she had believed. Margaret picked up the folder and walked upstairs to her apartment, placing the documents carefully on the kitchen table where the soft light from the window fell across the pages. She did not rush to read them again. Instead, she prepared a simple dinner, warming a bowl of soup and slicing a piece of bread while the quiet rhythm of the evening returned. For most of her life, Margaret had handled difficult realizations in the same way. First, she allowed the truth to settle. Then she considered what action, if any, was necessary. After dinner, she sat at the table and opened the folder once more. The filing Robert had shown her remained near the top of the stack. The date was clear. The expansion plan had been officially documented nearly 8 weeks before Daniel had called her describing an emergency. Margaret traced the printed line with her finger as if confirming that it had not changed since the afternoon meeting. The meaning behind the document was no longer confusing. Daniel and Jessica had already been planning to grow the company. The phone call had not come from sudden financial collapse. It had come during the middle of a planned expansion. Margaret closed the folder and leaned back slightly in her chair. She thought about the dinner from the previous week when Jessica had made her quiet remark across the table. At the time, Margaret had assumed the comment came from carelessness or poor judgment. Now the tone of that moment appeared different in her memory. Jessica had sounded confident, certain, almost amused, as if she had known exactly how the situation would unfold long before Margaret ever signed the closing papers on the house. Margaret stood and walked toward the small bookshelf in the living room where the photograph of Daniel in his Little League uniform still rested beside the older photograph of Margaret and Thomas standing in front of the Maplewood house. She lifted the picture frame carefully and studied her son's face in the image. Children trusted easily. They believed the adults around them were guiding every decision. Margaret wondered quietly when that simple certainty had changed. She did not believe Daniel had set out to deceive her with cruelty, but she could see now how easily ambition and pressure might lead someone to accept a solution that benefited them while asking someone else to carry the cost. Jessica, on the other hand, had never hidden her confidence in the company's future. She had spoken often about growth, expansion, an opportunity. Perhaps the plan had always been to move forward quickly if the necessary funding appeared. And Margaret's house had provided exactly that. The apartment grew quiet as the evening light faded outside the window. Margaret placed the photograph back on the shelf and returned to the table where the folder still waited. For several minutes, she sat without moving, simply considering the next step. The truth itself did not require anger. What mattered now was balance. Decisions made months earlier had shifted the direction of several lives, including her own. Margaret Whitmore had spent 68 years learning that patience often revealed the strongest position. And as the last light disappeared beyond the buildings across the street, she realized that the moment for quiet patience was nearly over. The time had come to decide what she would do with the clarity she now possessed. The next morning, Margaret Whitmore woke before sunrise and sat quietly at the small kitchen table with the folder of documents resting beside her coffee cup. The apartment was still, and the faint hum of traffic from the street below had not yet begun. She opened the folder one final time and reviewed the dates she now knew by heart. The expansion filing, the phone call, the house sale, the transfer of funds. Each event followed the next with almost perfect timing. For months Margaret had believed she had acted in response to an emergency. Now she understood that her decision had simply solved a financial challenge Daniel and Jessica had already been trying to overcome. Margaret closed the folder slowly and placed both hands on the table. What surprised her most was not the discovery itself. It was how calm she felt now that everything made sense. Clarity had a quiet power. Later that morning, Margaret made a short phone call to Daniel and suggested they have dinner together again the following weekend. Daniel sounded pleased, perhaps relieved that his mother was reaching out so soon after their last uncomfortable evening. He agreed immediately and mentioned that Jessica would prepare something special. Margaret thanked him politely and ended the call. The rest of the week passed quietly. She continued her daily walks through the neighborhood, visited the grocery store, and spent an afternoon organizing old photographs she had brought with her when she left the Maplewood house. On Saturday evening, she drove once again to Daniel and Jessica's home. The neighborhood was newer than the one she had left behind, with wide streets and large houses that stood close together along the block. When Margaret rang the doorbell, Jessica greeted her with a practiced smile and invited her inside. Dinner began much like the previous one. Plates were passed around the table, and casual conversation filled the room. Daniel spoke about new partnerships the company was developing, while Jessica described possible travel plans connected to upcoming conferences. Margaret listened patiently, occasionally nodding while the conversation unfolded. After the plates were cleared, Margaret reached into her purse and removed the thin folder she had brought with her. She placed it gently on the table and opened it to the page Robert had shown her earlier that week. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his expression curious. Jessica's smile remained in place, though her eyes moved quickly toward the document. Margaret spoke in the same calm voice she had used throughout the evening. She explained that she had recently reviewed several public filings related to the company's expansion and had noticed the timeline connected to those plans. Daniel read the page silently. The color in his face changed as he recognized the date printed near the top. Jessica's expression shifted more slowly, her confidence fading as the meaning of the document settled across the table. Margaret did not accuse anyone of wrongdoing. She simply explained that the money from the house had clearly supported a planned expansion rather than the sudden emergency she had believed existed. Daniel began to speak, but stopped, unsure how to explain the decision that had unfolded months earlier. Margaret raised her hand gently, signaling that no argument was necessary. She then added one final detail in the same steady tone. Before transferring the funds months ago, she had quietly arranged the transaction as a formal loan agreement through Robert Ellis, something she had done out of simple caution. The agreement required repayment over time once the business expansion began producing revenue. Daniel looked up in surprise. Jessica sat very still. Margaret closed the folder calmly and stood from the table. She wished them both success with the company and thanked them for dinner. When she stepped outside into the cool evening air, she felt lighter than she had in months. The woman Jessica once described so casually as homeless was now simply something else entirely. She was a mother who had given generously, but who had also learned when to reclaim her place in the story.